Good afternoon. I'm going to call to order our meeting of our Fiscal Committee for Tuesday, September 4th. I'd like to welcome everybody in Carnegie Town Hall Chambers, as well as all those on Channel 16 CityLink and SiouxFalls.org that may be watching. First order of business will be the approval of our minutes from Tuesday, July 3rd.
Move approval, Aguilar.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Minutes approved. We have two things on our agenda for this afternoon, and addressing both of those for the most part will be Mr. Rich Oaksall, our lead internal auditor. Our first agenda item is our fraud control policy. And I'm going to turn it over to Rich. And Rich, as I understand, we don't technically have a policy at this point. This is to institute a policy citywide for all city employees.
It would be it's a best practice. A lot of organizations have a fraud control policy, both in government and otherwise. And to come up with this policy, it was not a terribly difficult thing to do, because we could look on the internet and just see what other people did for their fraud control policies and adopt those policies to our needs. This has been in the work for, I think, over a year. And I worked with the city attorney's office and with the human resources director to come up with what you see before you, the draft policy. This policy has 4 goals, which is on the first page there. The prevention of fraud affecting the city of Sioux Falls. Number 2, the timely detection of instances of fraud affecting the city. Number 3, the recovery for the city of losses resulting from the fraud, and remedial steps to strengthen the internal processes and controls once fraud is detected. We do have a fraud hotline, which is also a best practice. We've had that since about 2008. And this policy encompasses that hotline. In other words, what happens when the call comes in? It goes to our third-party provider. I get an email report on my computer. And then from there on, we didn't really have a formal policy on what happens then. This policy puts in writing what happens then. We have a fraud coordination committee, which is on page, I believe on page 6. You should have your hard copy there. The fraud coordination committee is myself, the chair of the audit committee, the director of HR and the city attorney, and that committee would decide, okay, how do we proceed with this report that came in on the hotline. One thing that kept this policy from coming before you until this point was allegations against elected officials. None of us on the committee would feel comfortable investigating the mayor or city council member. So that has been addressed by the ordinance that you passed about the allegations against elected officials. That goes to the Board of Ethics for investigation. It would not be investigated by the city attorney or the internal audit. That's in those special situations, that would not be something that the fraud coordination committee would deal with. All other cases, we would figure out what to do with that. Not every call that's going to come in on a hotline, it needs to be investigated. Sometimes there's not enough information to do an investigation. Sometimes it results in somebody investigating it. It may not report or end up in a formal report if it's something of a minor nature. But every case is a little bit different, so we can't have a policy addressing every possible scenario that could happen. It's sort of up to the coordination committee to figure out how we're going to investigate a call that comes in. But as I said, this is an 8-page document. It's not just about the fraud hotline. There's section on what is fraud, what are we talking about, what are the responsibilities of internal audit and other entities within the city, what about the audit committee, what's their responsibility, how often do we do a fraud risk assessment. We're doing one right now. It's in our annual audit plan, and this policy gives some direction on how often that should happen and how that should work. It also identifies or gives some direction to supervisory personnel if they become aware of something in their department, what they're supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do. And there's a section on page 5 about retaliation. If somebody in good faith as an employee reports fraud, and for some reason it becomes known who made the accusation, and there's retaliation against them, this policy addresses that situation. Likewise, if somebody were to maliciously report fraud when in fact there was no fraud, they're just trying to get somebody in trouble, the policy discusses that situation as well. So I think it's fairly comprehensive. Like I said, we based it on what many organizations have in their fraud policy. And we've vetted it with the city attorney's office and with the HR director. And at this point, when I was talking to the city attorney, I think we would want to send this on to the full council with your permission and simply adopt this by resolution. So if there's any questions, we'd be happy to.
I think that's a good place to
Answer that.
begin with our committee is questions of Mr. Oaksall. Had time to read through this hopefully a little bit. It's in draft form. Seems to cover very comprehensive. Who helped you write this, Rich?
I was the primary drafter, but then I did have HR and the city attorney's office review the whole thing. We had a series of meetings, and we discussed changes to the original draft. But I was the main architect of the policy. So,
Okay. Other questions from the committee? Councilor Jameson.
Yeah, I would just remind us, I think, Sue, Jim, and I all serve on the audit committee. This stemmed from an event that we had learned about through the fraud hotline, and we were struggling with how do we proceed through it.
exactly.
Figure it out, and
Yeah.
I think it's great leadership here to get a policy in place, and it's good that you worked with the city attorneys and HR department, because that's where we found ourselves going, trying to figure out the next steps. One question I have, though, is, when you create a policy like this, a lot of times you implement practices to prevent fraud from happening. Mm-hmm. And you are certainly spend all your days trying to figure out where somebody might be stealing or hiding money or whatever, and if things are getting done appropriately too, not just for fraud, but certainly you were in that drawer looking for anything that could happen. And one thing that I wrote in my notes when I read through it was under the fraud detection segment. I put GPS there. Like if I had a business with a fleet of trucks out there, and I wanted to make sure that there wasn't fraud or people using my truck to go to the mall or wherever else, I would quietly put GPS tracking systems on all my vehicles, and I would be able to determine if fraud was occurring. Or I guess I would call it fraud, but a misuse of my assets.
Could be waste or abuse rather.
Waste or abuse,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
So do you recommend, or do you have any other new things that you would say we should?
Well, I can tell you that it's something that local governments have discussed. I think there's a few counties and city governments that have done that. It's something that needs to be discussed, obviously, with there can be issues with union contracts. There can be state laws about workplace surveillance. I think those laws can vary from state to state. Obviously, it's something that's being talked about. I didn't put it in the policy, but
GPS was just an example. I could see, like you say, surveillance cameras, other ways of making sure it didn't happen. But I don't know, I'm just looking down the road a little bit on where this is going to take us and what else we might have to do to really, beyond just hoping everybody just doesn't do it. What are you doing to make sure that if somebody does it, you're able to catch them?
Yeah, and as part of our fraud risk assessment, I've met with the directors and introduced what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I told them I will be scheduling individual meetings with directors here shortly. And I gave them a list of the questions I'll be discussing with them. And it's to identify scenarios or areas that we might be vulnerable. In their department, they might have more knowledge than I of ways that people could misuse assets or steal from the city. And what do we have in place that would either prevent it or detect it? There's a lot of technology now, especially with data extraction software, where you can do take a large body of data and sort it and sift it and identify things for further investigation. But certainly GPS, yeah, that's something that city and counties are looking at. I think there's a few that have implemented that, but I say that's a touchy subject, obviously with employee unions, workplace surveillance or state laws. There's privacy rights. You know, it's a complicated issue, so I didn't put it in the policy. You know.
If I could, just that you're going to be asking those questions is where I wanted to get to.
Yes, we're definitely sitting down with each director and going through that, and then if there's any areas that we think we're a little more vulnerable that we need to change some of our procedures or detection methods or internal controls, we'll certainly recommend those. So, yeah.
Councilor Enneman.
Yeah, in that same mode, reading through the 4 points that you have there, that last one I think really taps into it really good, and that's other tools and strategies deemed appropriate at the time.
Yeah, that's kind of the catch-all. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's good. That does allow us that flexibility that that Councilor Jamison was talking about, not knowing what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, and certainly that's something you want to have a clear, thorough discussion with all parties involved, the city attorney, HR director, and other parties that would.
I think this is good. We talked about the fuel cards as a prime example that the city has and how they're issued to individual people. And now with the technologies, we're able to better validate the use of those cards and things like that.
Yeah.
That's good. That's a good. It's a good protection for the citizens and our resources that we have. Thanks, Rich. Good job.
Okay.
Thank you. Councilor Jamison.
Going through the extra pages here, the pre-employment screening.
Yeah.
What is that again? I mean, how do you?
Well, that's something that HR and we identified. The director of HR will be responsible for identifying the screening policies and procedures. And right now, it depends on the job that a person is applying for. If you're applying to, say, be an accountant, it's a different screening than if you're applying to be an equipment operator.
Okay.
It involves a drug screen, criminal background checks. People that work with children, they check the sex offender list. They check references. They do a credit check, and they have a grid or a matrix. And depending on which job you're applying for, you wouldn't necessarily go through all the checks. It wouldn't be necessary, but other jobs, yeah, you're going to be thoroughly vetted before you're made an offer of employment to the city. So,
and then in the definition of the condition of a serious fraud investigation versus a minor, what would be just give me an example of what would be serious and maybe one that would be minor.
Well, that obviously be a judgment call of the committee. If it's perhaps a violation of a city policy, coordination committee says, maybe it's not really fraud, but it's something they shouldn't have been doing. It was a violation of department policy or city policy. That might be a minor issue. If they're actually stealing assets, committing an embezzlement, that might put it into the major category. If it's something that you would involve the legal system rather than just a disciplinary. So it's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to put in a policy every possible scenario that could come along and try to dream up, exactly what you would do in that situation. So we give ourselves a little leeway on that, a little judgment. Okay.
I guess what I'm going to look for now is consensus to take this to the full council in the form of a resolution and a time frame in which to do this. I don't see any need to rewrite from what I've heard or anything, major changes to this.
I would make a motion to move it on to the city council for approval.
Second that too.
Okay. And what about time frame? Do we need anything specific? Next available?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a motion and a second to take this to the full council for our next, as soon as we can, I guess. All in favor?
Aye.
And opposed, same sign?
Dean, if I could, one other thing we probably often forget to do sometimes is we've read this, we've reviewed it. Is this available on the website, or could it be? How do we get the public?
Well, it was on the agenda for this meeting, and certainly it'll be on the agenda for the city council meeting, and we could email it to them.
Okay, so the public has access to it. That's all I was getting to.
Yes.
Okay.
Always necessary. Thank you, Councilor Jamison. And stay there, Rich. Developing citywide fees, including park department fees. You and Jim David, I know, have been working on this.
Yes.
Are you going to take the lead on this?
Yeah, Jim's going to give a little update on where we're at on that. It was based upon our audit we did this year, and we had a recommendation that we develop a citywide policy on fees. So,
okay.
we'll have a brief update on that.
Welcome, Mr. David.
Thanks. The original intent of this proposal was actually to categorize the city fees into how they're able to recoup their costs. For example, our swimming passes maybe recoup about 10% of that cost. And so they'd be in one category, whereas you have an enterprise fund that would have 100% of those costs recouped. That'd be in a separate category. Both Rich and I had met with our city directors and trying to develop some sort of a plan moving forward on this. And it was the decision, it was a consensus of the group to wait until we have those fees or in the recodification effort, all those fees in one section of ordinance before we move further. And then we were going to work with Tracy Turbach in going piecemeal through each department instead of going overarching into every single department in one single move. So we decided to wait until the fees were in one section of ordinance. And the same thing goes with those fees being online for consumers or residents in order to see. And we decided to, again, to wait until those are in the section of ordinance, because what's going to happen is when somebody goes in to check and see what a fee is, they're going to be able to click on that link to go directly to city ordinance. The thought of the group, of course, is that instead of placing that responsibility on multiple individuals or on one single individual, if you have it linked to city ordinance, that will be updated, it will be fresh. Because the last thing you want to do is have information on a website that's not fresh and people no longer utilize it. So,
Okay, so our timeline currently is?
well, hopefully the recodification effort, I know that Lori's going to be having an update on that, on the progress of recodification. But as soon as that happens, we'll begin to meet with both Rich and I with Tracy to move forward by department, probably start with either Public Works or with Parks.
Okay. When would you see a need to update us again on this?
A lot of it depends. I'll defer to Lori here. She's going to talk about recodification.
The Public Services Committee will give a report next Tuesday on the 11th as far as the recodification process. We're getting very close to that. We will plan on having a first reading at the last meeting in November, with second reading on the recodification the first meeting in December. And the codification would be effective January 1st of 2013. So shortly thereafter, we should receive our books, if not our online version, sooner than that. So probably, maybe not the January meeting. I guess we could tentatively plan it for January if it's ready to go. Otherwise, the February Fiscal Committee meeting may be more appropriate.
Okay, so several months out then anyway.
Yeah.
So, okay. Okay, questions of Jim David or Rich Holksel on this process? All righty, we'll consider that one closed. Open discussion, future topics, any concerns? Councilor Jameson.
Does anybody remember what Councilor Staggers, we put him off the last time we met, and it's been quite some time now. And do you remember what his topic was? I know he's not here, but
Yes, he wanted to basically have a process kind of like what we were looking at in regarding our CIP excess funds, supplementing, that process to, should we have a process of how we look at maybe returning or refunding or rebating that money back to the citizenry of Sioux Falls. And I've left it open for him to come to present anytime he is willing or ready to at our fiscal committee. I've not heard from him since. As far as scheduling, I think he's still interested in it, but I have not heard from him.
I can follow up on the scheduling and find out when he may be ready
Okay.
to do that.
thank you. I just knew there was something waiting out there, but.
Yes. Any others? Okay, I will adjourn this meeting. Thank you for your attendance.